Sega's Genesis is Nintendo's nemesis. It's one of two 16-bit systems that are already in the US.
Nintendo has sort of owned the video game market for the past several years, but new 16-bit game machines from NEC and Sega are challenging Nintendo.
See to the box office. It looks to me like we're cruising towards a $7.5 billion business.
Rumors started coming out that Sega was no longer manufacturing Dreamcast.
I like Genesis.
When it comes to interesting stories from the world of gaming, very few stories are as interesting as Sega's. A story of an American company shifting not only cultures, but one that's changed amidst industry troubles and financial downfalls. Although Sega is still around today, albeit as a third-party development studio / publisher, they're still making growth. However, we aren't talking about the Sega of today. This video will cover Sega from its birth towards the end of the Dreamcast era. Most people more commonly know Sega from their time with the Genesis in the 1990s.
Sonic the Hedgehog, more action, more speed. Sega Genesis, it's a whole lot more for less.
However, they have actually been around much longer than most people realize. Even Sega doesn't usually acknowledge the history past the 1960s when the company first began use of the Sega name.
In their earliest incarnation, Sega initially went by the name Standard Games. The change in namesake wasn't the only difference between both iterations of Sega. In fact, Sega originally began when the original founders, Martin Bromley, Irving Brommer, and James Humpert, came up with the idea of creating coin-operated machines for military bases in the 1940s.
However, after the conclusion of World War II, the founders would sell Standard Games and establish a new distributor called Service Games. Also around this time, the United States government would go on to outlaw slot machines in all U.S. territories, leaving the company with little to no options for business in the West.
So in 1952, Bromley would send employees Richard Stewart and Ray Lemaire to Tokyo, Japan, eventually establishing themselves by 1953 as Service Games of Japan. They would still continue to provide coin-operated slot machines to U.S. bases only in Japan.
The Sega name would be coined soon after this. The name Sega actually comes from an abbreviation of Service Games. The brand wouldn't officially be changed until the early 1960s once the Service Games of Japan division was dissolved.
The Sega we know today wouldn't become a reality until two events happened. One happening in 1960 and the other in 1965. In 1960, Bromley would establish two new companies to take over all business activities, Nihon Garaku Busan and Nihon Kikai Saitso. Saitso's primary task was to handle the manufacturing of Sega's machines, while Busan distributed the products.
The two companies would later merge in 1964. A year later in 1965, another coin-operated company by the name of Rasen Enterprises would be purchased by Nihon Garaku Busan. They would form Sega Enterprises, with Rasen's owner David Rasen as CEO and managing director.
Sega would eventually stop leasing their machines to military bases. Instead, they'd later become a publicly traded company, importing things like jukeboxes, pinball games, and gun games. This would lead to the development of their own titles.
Turn it up!
Who's behind the mask?
In the high-technology world of video arcade entertainment, there is one extraordinary game that soars a dimension above the rest. Zaxxon, from the master design engineers of Sega.
And so it was, late in the 20th century, that a populace fell upon the land. A plague of home videos that were limited in intelligence. There was brain drain, and terminal boredom swept the countryside. The maker looked down and was not pleased by what he saw, and said, "This is not good."
Sega's venture into the world of gaming wouldn't be the kind they're known for today. They would originally start off designing electromechanical games. Their first game was actually a submarine simulator game called Periscope, as well as a traditional pinball game.
Sega's new business plan would prove to be very successful for them, especially in Japan. In fact, Sega was the first company to standardize the arcade price of a quarter before it became the commonly accepted price.
Around the early 1970s, Sega would be purchased by yet another company. That company was the American conglomerate Gulf and Western Industries. The company was primarily known at the time for publishing a variety of entertainment media from music, movies, and television studios.
Shortly after this, Sega would release their first arcade video game. This game was titled Pongtron. Pongtron was essentially a Pong clone, one of many that began to pop up during that time due to Atari's success. Although not much data exists about Pongtron today, it's safe to assume the game did well, considering a sequel would be released later that same year.
Sega would go on to prosper in the arcade boom of the 1970s, going up against the heavyweights dominating the market during the time. With revenues reaching well over $100 million, Sega would go on to acquire the company Gremlin Industries. Gremlin primarily dealt in the manufacturing process of microprocessor arcade games.
Fortunately for Sega, they would become one of the top 5 ranking arcade game developers of the early 1980s, publishing games like Head-On, Zaxxon, and their licensed titles like Frogger.
Unfortunately, there would be a downturn. As a result of the crash of 1983, Sega would be forced to sell most of their licensing and manufacturing rights for their arcade titles. The rights to those games would go to a company named Bally Manufacturing, famous for pinball and slot machines.
Shortly after, Sega would go through one of their first company course corrections. Then president at the time, Hayao Nakayama, felt that the company should move on and utilize their newfound hardware expertise
in a new market, the home console market.
Will you be the one to witness the birth of the incredible Nintendo Entertainment System?
Okay, the game is Shinobi. Get over the Nintendo Entertainment System.
Sega Master System. The challenge will always be there.
The Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, play with power.
Although the crash of 1983 caused the home console market to die in the West, the East console market was still in its infancy. Another reason for Sega's interest was due to rumors that Nintendo was developing their own home console. Sega's team would eventually agree with Nakayama, leading them to start development.
1983 saw the release of the SG-1000 and the SC-3000 computer in Japan. Both would release the same day as Nintendo's Famicom system. Unfortunately for Sega, their first outing wouldn't be as successful as their arcade offerings, among many reasons. The main one being that the system lacked the software name recognition of the Famicom.
Fortunately for Sega, they'd set their own launch projections reasonably low. Originally estimating that they'd sell 50,000 units, they'd managed to sell over 100,000 units. However, by 1983, the SG-1000 would ultimately fail to overtake the Famicom's success.
The SG-1000's hardware was also lacking in terms of power when compared to Nintendo's Famicom. Not to mention it had a lack of third-party software, something Nintendo also knew to capitalize on. The console would be discontinued in 1984.
Sega would see yet another change shortly after the SG-1000 was discontinued. Sadly, Gulf and Western founder Charles Bloodhorn would pass away the previous year. This left the company to divest all secondary businesses that were deemed unnecessary. Sega was on that list. Luckily, Nakayama and Rosen would arrange a buyout in 1984 thanks to the financial backing from CSK Corporation, a company known for creating software.
Sega would continue development on new hardware and software after the transition completed in 1985. The Mark III, Sega's next console, would begin development with intentions to learn from previous mistakes. The system would be released in North America as well, only it would be rebranded as the Sega Master System.
Although Sega's Master System would be superior to the NES on a technical level, the Master System would have trouble gaining traction. It would also make attempts to gain third-party support. They had to settle for porting the games themselves.
In the 1980s, Nintendo had development studios sign special contracts. If they wanted to publish their works on Nintendo hardware, they wouldn't be able to port their games to other consoles. Sega would gain the rights to port from other developers. However, their efforts would yield unsatisfying results financially.
The Master System would unfortunately share the same fate as the SG-1000, especially in the West. The main reason is credited to marketing decisions by toy company Tonka's behalf. The console would actually prove to be quite the success in Europe though, even going as far as to outsell the NES by a considerable margin, with 6 million units sold. The console would officially discontinue in 1992.
The Master System would even have continued success in Brazil, where new versions of the system continued to be released and distributed by Sega's partner Tectoy. By 2016, the Master System had sold over 8 million units in Brazil. It's currently recognized as the longest-lived console in history.
Although the Master System wasn't the massive success Sega was hoping for, it would serve as an important stepping stone for something much greater. The system that would take them to the next level.
Come on!
And so it was. He brought forth Genesis, a system with twice the power, twice the intelligence, twice the challenge, twice the fun. Only a chosen few were called forth to experience this new dimension of high-definition graphics and studio sound.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do?
Following yet another attempt to find success in the console market, Sega would go back to the drawing board yet again. Only this time they'd begin development of their 16-bit microprocessor console, the Mega Drive.
Now what is a 16-bit microprocessor? It was used in just about every advertisement for the Genesis. They even went as far as to put it on top of their first model shell. In short, a 16-bit microprocessor essentially adds a larger pixel count and a boost in color palette per scan line on your television. The reason for using it in the marketing was to further explain the difference in power between current and past home systems. Also, pixels were able to be drawn at a faster rate, hence the term blast processing.
What if you don't have blast processing?
The Mega Drive released in Japan on October 29, 1988. Super Mario Bros. 3 would release a week earlier. Unfortunately, the game would overshadow the Mega Drive's launch. However, positive coverage from Famitsu would help build excitement around the system. The Mega Drive would go on to sell over 400,000 units in its first year.
The Mega Drive would eventually be prepared for a North American launch around 1989, originally going to Atari to head up the marketing region. However, after Atari declined the offer, Sega would launch the system under its Sega of America subsidiary.
The newly titled Sega Genesis would launch on August 14, 1989. The marketing campaign would be helmed by former Atari executive and then Sega of America CEO Michael Katz. He created a two-part plan to build sales. The first involved the marketing campaign to challenge Nintendo head-on and emphasize more arcade-like games. The more well-known slogan being,
Genesis does what Nintendo.
Sega's second strategy involved utilizing recognizable likenesses of celebrities and athletes for most of their games.
Sega Genesis is a whole lot more for less.
It would still be an uphill battle for Sega, overcoming Nintendo's ubiquity in homes. Sega would sell 500,000 units in its first year.
Sega would begin development on a series to compete with Nintendo's flagship character Mario. They felt a company mascot would help create appeal for their brand. The result came from artist Naoto Oshima, designing a teal hedgehog with red shoes. His name was originally Mr. Needlemouse. The name would later be changed to the more well-known Sonic the Hedgehog. Oshima's intentions was to create a character that transcended race, gender, and was easy for children to draw.
Sonic would be developed further by Yuji Naka, who created a tech demo that allowed a sprite to move smoothly on a curve, allowing Sonic to run in a circular motion in the game's iconic loops and hills with great speed. Sonic's color was chosen to match Sega's cobalt blue logo, his shoes inspired by Michael Jackson's boots, and his personality by Bill Clinton's can-do attitude.
Sure was.
I forgot about that.
What did you say?
Oh, dude, just listen to this. And his personality by Bill Clinton's can-do attitude.
That's a real thing. That's cool. In the mid-1990s, Nakayama hired Tom Kalinske to replace Cass as CEO of Sega of America. Kalinske was a firm believer in the razor and blades business model. What is the razor and blades business model? It's a strategy wherein one item is sold at a low price in order to increase sales of the complementary good. Give them the razor, sell them the blades, which meant sell the console at a low price and sell the public games with accessories.
He created a 4-point plan. Cut the price of the console, create a US-based team to develop games targeted at the American market, expand the aggressive advertising campaigns, and replace the bundled game Altered Beast with Sonic the Hedgehog. Although the Japanese board of directors disapproved of the plan, Nakayama encouraged him, saying, "I hired you to make the decisions for Europe and the Americas, so go ahead and do it."
Thanks to the efforts of Sega's marketing team and the popularity of Sonic the Hedgehog, the Sega Genesis would outsell the Super Nintendo in the United States by 1991, and by January 1992, Sega would control 65% of the console market. It would be the first time since 1985 that Nintendo wouldn't be the leader. Sega was finally finding their groove, and they would continue to build off their newfound success.
In 1990, Sega would launch their Game Gear handheld console to compete against Nintendo's Game Boy. The console was designed to be a portable version of the Master System and featured better hardware than the Game Boy. The Sega Game Gear wouldn't have the same success that the Genesis did, showing poor sales in its first year. This was primarily due to the fact that the system featured a short battery life, lack of original games, and weak support from Sega.
Sega would also build off the success of the Genesis by creating a disc-based add-on in 1991 called the Mega CD. The Mega CD would launch in the West in 1992, only the add-on would be titled the Sega CD. The expansion would greatly expand the potential size of the Genesis with upgraded graphics and sound capabilities. Although the Sega CD featured games like Sonic CD and Snatcher, the add-on would only sell 100,000 units during its first year.
This wouldn't be Sega's last attempt at expanding the Genesis lifespan. They would release another add-on called the Sega 32X. which would serve as a less expensive entry into the 32-bit era, although the 32X would share the Sega CD's fate by selling well below sales expectations and having only a handful of titles. The Sega 32X and the Sega CD are both considered commercial failures. Although the Sega Genesis was still selling at this time, it was clear consumers were ready to move on to something new.
Let's get scratching.
We are 5 years away from entering the 21st century. Humankind stands on the edge of the interactive age. You have come a long way. But are you ready for the future?
On November 22nd, 1994, Sega would release their next console. The system would be a true 32-bit home console and successor to the Genesis. The system would be called the Sega Saturn, the big selling point of the Saturn being several arcade ports as well as original games, including Sega's arcade smash hit Virtua Fighter. Although the Sega Saturn originally didn't have 3D-capable hardware to support the title, Sega would develop another display processor shortly before launch. This was in order to compete with Sony's PlayStation 1 and Nintendo's N64. The system was successful in Japan, however the system would be a commercial failure in the West. The reason being was due to launching at the wrong time and being very expensive.
I believe in the summer of 1995, which was the wrong time to launch. Also at a very expensive price point. I believe it launched at $3.99 versus $2.99 and did not have very good games. If you want to play a game, you want to have fun.
After the Nintendo 64 launched in late 1996, the Saturn would rapidly lose its remaining market share. Sega's failure to develop a true Sonic game is also considered a factor in the console's poor performance. Instead, getting a poor racing game, a compilation of Sonics 1 through 3, and a port of Sonic 3D Blast. The Saturn was also notorious for being difficult to program for, leading to a lack of titles for the system.
Then in 1996, after long-standing disagreements with Sega of Japan, Kalinsky would lose interest in his work as CEO of Sega of America and part ways. Shoichiro Irimajiri would be appointed chairman and CEO of Sega of America later that year. David Rosen and Nakayama would also resign from their positions as chairman and co-chairman of Sega of America as well. However, they both remained with the company. Bernie Stoller, former executive at Sony Computer Entertainment of America, would be named Sega of America's executive vice president of product development.
Stolar was not supportive of the Saturn. Believing its hardware was poorly designed, he publicly announced at E3, "The Saturn is not our future." Stolar had no interest in lying to people about the Saturn's prospects. Sega would begin winding down support for the system shortly after. Although the system isn't looked upon as fondly as Sega's other offerings, the system would still offer many great experiences like Nights into Dreams, Virtua Fighter 2, Panzer Dragoon, and many other titles.
Understand the concept of love. Understand the concept of love. Understand the concept of love.
Despite taking massive losses on the Saturn, Sega felt confident about their next project, a successor to the Saturn. Their next system would be called the Sega Dreamcast. The name is a mix between Dream and Broadcast. Sega would also announce that they'd launch with a new 3D Sonic game, Sonic Adventure. Although the Dreamcast was well received not only in marketing and in public demonstrations, the system would face a rocky start. Unfortunately, Sega wouldn't be able to achieve shipping goals during the Japanese launch due to a shortage of Power VR chips. Although the chipset was what gave the system its power, it had a high failure rate in the manufacturing process. Sega would then have to cancel pre-orders.
On November 1998, the Dreamcast would launch with its entire stock selling out in just one day. However, only one of 4 games would prove to be popular, Virtua Fighter 3, which is considered to be the most successful arcade game Sega has ever released. Sonic Adventure would be delayed until the following week. Sega would, however, have better success in the West, thanks to relations with Midway Games and the 10-month period following the Japan launch. Despite bitterness over the Saturn, Stoller would successfully repair relations with major US retailers, helping Sega pre-sale 300,000 units.
Sega of America's Senior Vice President of Marketing, Peter Moore, would help to develop the Dreamcast's It's Thinking campaign. The reason for the campaign was to emphasize the Dreamcast's power while also apologizing for the sins of their past, invoking all the things people loved about Sega from its Genesis days. Then on August 11th, Sega of America would confirm that Stolar had been fired, leaving Moore to direct the launch.
I didn't agree with who was at that then became my boss, Mr. Okawa. We had a parting of the ways, and I left the company. It was unfortunate, but the team that I had built and the team that had really helped build the launch, they were in place. They were ready to go. They were ready to drive the product.
The Dreamcast launched in North America on September 9th, 1999, at the price of $199, which Sega's marketing dubbed $99.99 for $199. Sega would set a new sales record by selling more than 225,000 Dreamcast units in 24 hours, earning the company $98.4 million, in what Moore called the biggest 24 hours in entertainment retail history. By Christmas, Sega held 31% of the North American video game market share, thanks to significant launch games like Soul Calibur. However, their success would be overshadowed by the looming promise of something new from Sony.
Rumors started coming out that Sega was no longer manufacturing Dreamcast.
On March 2nd, 1999, Sony would make a highly publicized vaporware-like announcement, revealing the details of its next-generation PlayStation, emphasizing that the PS2 would be backwards compatible with the original PlayStation and could play DVD movies, features that the Dreamcast lacked.
Sega's initial momentum proved fleeting as US Dreamcast sales began to decline as early as January of 2000. Although it wasn't a complete loss, as Dreamcast's overall sales for the term still increased by 27%, exceeding the company's expectations. However, those increasing sales would slowly falter over time. Sega's Japanese arcade business also faced financial troubles, forcing the company to close over 246 locations.
Sega of America president Peter Moore and Sega of Japan's developers focused on the US market to prepare for the upcoming launch of the PlayStation 2.
Although this effort was for the purpose of increasing interest in the Dreamcast, it wouldn't change the course Sega was on. Peter Moore would go on to state that the Dreamcast would need to sell 5 million units in the US by the end of 2000 in order to remain a viable platform. But Sega ultimately fell short of this goal. Decreasing the price and announcing new titles just wasn't enough to bring in new customers. The PlayStation 2 would launch on October 26th.
Although the launch of the PlayStation 2 was seen with shortages due to a manufacturing glitch, it was hoped that Sega could use this opportunity to convince disappointed PlayStation fans to pick up their console instead. According to Moore, the PlayStation 2 effect that we were relying upon didn't work for us. People will hang on for as long as possible. What effectively happened is that the PlayStation 2's lack of availability froze the marketplace. This would begin the biggest decline in the company's history.
On May 22nd of the year 2000, Okawa replaced Irimajiri as president of Sega. Okawa had long advocated that Sega abandon the console business, and he wasn't the only one to believe this within the company. Sega co-founder David Rosen had always felt that it was a bit of a folly for them to be limiting their potential to Sega hardware. Even Stolar had previously suggested that Sega should have sold their company to Microsoft. Then in September of 2000, in a meeting with Sega's Japanese executives and the heads of the company's major Japanese game studios, Moore and Belfield recommended that Sega abandon its console business and focus on software, prompting the studio heads to walk out.
Then on January 31st, 2001, the unthinkable happened. Sega announced the discontinuation of the Dreamcast after March 31st. They would also state that they were restructuring the company as a platform-agnostic third-party developer. The final Dreamcast unit manufactured was autographed by the heads of all 9 of Sega's internal game development studios, as well as the heads of Visual Concepts and Wavemaster. The system was given away with 55 first-party games through a competition by GamePro magazine.
Sega would go through a lot of changes over the next few years, releasing games on Microsoft, Nintendo, and Sony consoles. Sega to this day is currently in its rebranding phase, trying to pick up the pieces from mistakes made along this new journey since the Dreamcast. As of writing this script, it has been 20 years since the Dreamcast launched. Although there are no signs of the company getting back into the console market anytime soon, it's nice to know Sega is still around. They may not be a perfect company, and at times it seems they've lost their way, but the Blue brand will always be one of the most influential stories and group of individuals in the industry.